Hello, everybody. Welcome to Most Censored Views. I'm your host, Lee Camp, the most censored comedian in America. And yeah, it's good to have you here. This is a new interview series we've just started. The previous two were with Steven Donziger and Chris Hedges. Please check those out if you didn't see them. But today I've got an excellent guest for you. And by the way, tomorrow is I'll be talking with Scott Ritter as well. But for today, I'm talking to one of my favorite journalists, and he was one of my favorite journalists before I joined the same outlet as him, Mint Press, which is an amazing outlet. You should definitely check it out if you don't know it. Yes, he's a senior editor there and does amazing work. And I'm going to talk to him about several of his most recent stories. The most recent one is about how Call of Duty, one of the highest selling video games of all time, and these are kind of newer evidence. There's been earlier stuff, but newer evidence that Call of Duty is a U.S. government psyop and just full-on propaganda. And yeah, so we're going to get into the details of that and what new information we have on that. But we're also going to get into a lot of other stuff, such as the government connections between our largest social media entities and the U.S. government. But yeah, lot of great stuff coming up, and I hope you enjoy this talk. This is, again, one of my favorite journalists, Alan MacLeod.
What's up, Lee?
Hey,
how are you doing? I'm doing great.
Good. Glad you're doing well. Thanks for being here. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for asking me on.
So we'll kind of just dive right into it, and then later maybe I'll get into some of those more vague questions, such as why are you a journalist, and if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? But for right now, let's get into your latest story, which is pretty incredible. And I want to start off with, I think everyone's heard the name Call of Duty. I'm not a gamer. I know what it is, but not that familiar with it. But you can't really overstate how popular, how many people play this thing, how much money it brings in. And for popular culture, this is kind of one of the most prevalent and influential ways to propagandize people. And so I was wondering if you talk about that for a second, and also why are video games so good for this kind of manipulation?
Yeah, I mean, Call of Duty is just like a cash cow for its developers. It is an absolute behemoth. They've released game after game after game, year after year. In just the most recent one that's just come out, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, in only 10 days, that earned over $1 billion in revenue, which absolutely wipes the floor with even the biggest blockbuster movies.
Yeah, I was thinking that, we look at like Marvel movies and stuff and we go, wow, nothing could ever make that much money. And this makes way more.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is played in all countries in the world. Not only that, but it's kind of like pushed to quite impressionable young people. People play it for hours, weeks, even months on end. The same game all over and all over and all over and over again. That's not really kind of the same as a movie, whereby you might see it for 2 hours and maybe, if you really like it, again and again. But with a video game, that sort of level of penetration into people's conscious and just the popular psyche is really unparalleled and unmatched. And that's why they're such a potent source of propaganda. And that's why, as this investigation shows, why the US national security state and the military more generally are so interested in having their points of view echoed throughout these games.
And for those of you looking at this, if you're unfamiliar with video games, this is not a movie. This is the video game. Like, it's horrifically realistic. And so the part of this story that I think people have known for a long time is that Call of Duty, or at least several years, is that Call of Duty is heavily used to recruit for the U.S. military, get young people to think this is what they want to do with their lives. They want to be involved in these kind of important missions for the country that involve killing people, but they're always killing the bad guys. And so the recruitment aspect of it is nothing new. But what you've unveiled in this latest article is the connections between the US government and Call of Duty and Call of Duty's parent company, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act by Tom Secker, the journalist and investigator, showed that there is a really unparalleled connection between the national security state and the video game industry. And Call of Duty, the franchise around it, is really a perfect example of that. So, for instance, in September 2018, the documents show we know that the Call of Duty Activision Blizzard producer Coco Francini was invited to the United States Air Force's headquarters in Florida. And the explicit reason for bringing her there was, in their own words, the US military, to showcase their hardware to her and to make her a more, quote, credible advocate for the US war machine. They didn't use the word war machine, I better be clear. They used the word
Yeah.
credible advocate for our views or something like that. That was me,
Right.
tweeting it basically. But yeah, the documents show that they were very excited about this, that they've got a bunch of people working on future blockbusters, and they're so stoked to have these heavy hitters from the entertainment industry come in. And yeah, we know that on that trip that she was shown CV-22 helicopters and AC-130 gunships, which do make appearances in many Call of Duty games. But that sort of connection goes back years and years and years with the military and Call of Duty. Call of Duty have, for a long time, needed the military to give them access to all the latest equipment so they can get the realism aspect down to a T. They discuss plots and strategies and just all sorts of things that go into the games with military figures. For example, people like disgraced Colonel Oliver North. Yeah, going back.
Who was prosecuted for Iran-Contra, for those who don't know.
That's correct. He was one of the main figures in the Iran-Contra affair. And yeah, even going back to as far as you want, really, more than a decade, we've even seen situations where the military have raised objections about a Call of Duty game, and as a result, those games are not even made. So ultimately, we've seen the example of the military actually just saying no, and that military game just not being made. Ironically, that was because back 10 years ago, the Call of Duty producers wanted to make a game where the US goes to war with China, and the US military didn't like that. Now, 10 years in the future, I don't think that would be so much of a problem.
Right. Now they might be like, oh, that fits perfectly.
Yeah, exactly. I guess we also have to look at who is actually on the board of Activision Blizzard, who is the producer of Call of Duty. If you look at their leadership webpage, it's like a who's who of high state officials from the national security state. It really reads like it's like some sort of hawkish think tank that develops policies for NATO. One of the people you should certainly be aware of is Frances Townsend, who is the senior counsel. And until September, she was the chief compliance officer and the executive vice president for corporate affairs. Townsend spent her career moving up the ladder of the national security state. She was head of intelligence for the Coast Guard, and she was the counterterrorism deputy for Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State. And then in 2004, she got her big break when she was appointed by President George Bush to her Intelligence Advisory Board. And in that role as pretty much the senior person in the Bush administration on counterterrorism, she really became, in the early 2000s, the voice and the face of the war on terror. She was on the television regularly, drumming up threats about a potential second Al-Qaeda attack, something that never happened. She helped popularize the phrase enhanced interrogation techniques, which is, for younger viewers who don't remember, a euphemism for torture, the sort of torture that happened at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. In fact, the person who was in charge, a military officer who was in charge of Abu Ghraib prison, said that Townsend actually visited the facility and put pressure on him to ramp up the torture program there, saying that they needed more intelligence to be squeezed from these people. And that's really just one example of the sort of people who are on this terrible board.
And, It would seem bizarre for a higher up in US government like Francis Townsend or some of these others to go to a video game company if it weren't for the fact that our military industrial complex views this video game and a few others as really important to both the US propaganda and recruitment. So in a way, she didn't go to a video game company. She went to a different arm of the US propaganda field.
Yeah, exactly. There's a ton of people like Francis Townsend on there. There's Brian Bulatow, who was third in command of the CIA before he dropped into this video game company as well. It seems completely incongruous to most people. But as you said, the US entertainment machine is very much intertwined with the US war machine as well. And this is one more, example of this phenomenon that's been going on for the last couple of decades. When we look at recruitment, the US military uses video games constantly. They've got their own esports team. The US Army actually plays Call of Duty in professional esports leagues to try to market the Army to young people, especially young boys, teenagers, on platforms such as Twitch, where they market the military lifestyle to these boys and try to give them the false impression that if they join up for the Army, they might well just be gaming all day, which is absolutely ridiculous. You will not be gaming if you join the Army, everyone.
Right.
So there's all sorts of things that go on trying to market the military and that lifestyle to young people, particularly young boys who increasingly spend so much of their time online. And that's why so many Army recruiters, you don't see them quite as much at malls or fairs or anything like that. They're actually online talking to your kids through voice chat, often without parental knowledge, often with pretty much no oversight whatsoever. This is a new frontier in the way in which the Army are desperately trying to match their recruitment goals.
And talk about some of the storylines that have been in Call of Duty that just completely mirror US operations, or US, or some of them before, some of them after.
Yeah, I mean, geez, let's talk about the most recent game, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. The first mission of that is just an absolute one-for-one carbon copy of the Trump administration's strike on General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Now, if you remember that, what happened there was Soleimani was actually in Iraq. He was invited by the Prime Minister of Iraq for peace talks with Saudi Arabia, which could have led to lasting peace in the entire region. The Prime Minister of Iraq specifically asked Donald Trump for permission to invite Soleimani, which really shows who's wearing the pants in that relationship. And then the Trump administration said yes, and then used the opportunity to carry out a drone strike on this guy. Now, Qasem Soleimani was a general and a military leader, but he was also a political leader in Iran. American polls, for instance, one by the University of Maryland, found that more than 80% of the population of Iran had a good or very good opinion of Soleimani. And that was really because even Western sources acknowledged that he was the general most responsible for crushing ISIS in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And so when the American government committed this huge international crime by killing a foreign leader in Iraq, this was met with absolute horror and outrage in Iraq and Iran. But in the United States, it was, oh, America took out the world's #1 bad guy. That was like one of the headlines from CBS News, I remember. And so
even if you didn't care at all about this general, this could have popped off World War III. I mean, it was incredibly risky.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I believe the Iranians even carried out a strike against US forces in retaliation, which raised tensions even higher. So yeah, you as impressionable young people, we get our Xbox controller, our PlayStation controller, and we are made to recreate this strike. Except in the game, his name is General Gobrani, but he looks almost exactly like Soleimani. And
I'm showing that image on the screen.
There he is. Yeah. That's a perfect example. I mean, listen, we're told that, you have to carry out this strike because he's under the thumb of Russians and he's just about to do some terrorism in the United States, which is utter blatant lies. But there you go. That's video game industry for you. But this isn't the first time you have to assassinate a foreign leader in Call of Duty. There have been missions where you had to kill Fidel Castro with a headshot, or kill Hugo Chavez, the former president of Venezuela. Again, that's one of the pinnacles of one of the earlier games. And so ultimately, they're selling the idea of assassinating foreign leaders as like not only something that is neutral, but is actually something that's very good. And it's this sort of pernicious propaganda which pervades the entire series of Call of Duty. They also whitewash US war crimes as well. For instance, the Highway of Death, the infamous US war crime carried out in the first Gulf War, whereby hundreds of Iraqi soldiers and civilians were mown down on Highway 80, I believe, between Kuwait and Basra. That was replayed in the Call of Duty series as a war crime. But instead of the Americans doing it, it was the Russians doing it. So the reality is just invented in these games and then shoved down our throats as pure ideology. And what these games show you, or what these games try to teach you, is the United States can do no wrong, and Russia or Cuba or Iran, they're our enemies and they must be stopped at all costs. So there's no sense of pacifism, or maybe we're the bad guys, the ones that always start the wars and, killed millions of people in the last few decades. There's absolutely none of that. It's just pure unrepentant militarism. And it's particularly pernicious because this is an absolute global phenomenon, which pretty much every young person in the West has played this game at some point.
Yeah, I mean, and then there was another one that I remember where a few years ago they had one of the missions being to sneak into Venezuela and knock out their electrical grid, and then sure enough, that was done a few years later. And they don't know. Venezuela is not certain who did it, but it seems very likely it could have been the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it wouldn't be the first or last time the US would do some sort of skullduggery like that in a foreign country. It's well known that producers of entertainment, like, for instance, the Homeland series or Call of Duty, regularly liaise with top military generals or other figures in the US military and get them to advise on plot lines. In fact, it seems that half of the writers of Call of Duty belong to the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's think tank. And so on a daily basis, they're talking to American military generals and strategists who are advising them on the plot. And so it's not surprising that things that happen in real life seem to, life imitates art and art imitates life in these sorts of scenarios.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Atlantic Council, because they're going to come into play in the next story we talk about with Facebook. But the Atlantic Council is viewed as this, they try and put themselves as some sort of unbiased, think tank or whatever, but it really is just, it's NATO, it's US government, it's military alliance brain trust. And, as you mentioned in your article, the board of directors includes Kissinger, Condoleezza Rice, and others, CIA directors. So anyone thinking they're going to get any kind of truth out of the Atlantic Council is laughable. And I just one final note on video games. Like, what does it say about our society that we choose to make simulated realities of killing and massacring and death and empire rather than imagining a better world? Like, it seems like these games either have to simulate murder, or maybe there's some kind of sports game, but most of the big ones and the ones I've heard of, there's very little about creating any kind of better world. It's just about death and destruction. And I guess the question is that because that's the only thing people will buy? It's the only thing they're interested in? Or is that because the powers at the top of these systems, such as the Atlantic Council and the others involved in the making of Call of Duty, want that to be what you're thinking about? They're not going to talk about peace. They're not going to talk about a sustainable world. They don't want you visualizing that, and they're not going to put the money into creating that type of thing. Anyway, I won't make you answer that because that's not a journalist question. That's an opinion, I guess. But
Well, all I'll say about that is, yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like a crotchety old man with like a bad back, but certainly it really is a reflection on an extremely and profoundly sick society. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we had games where you just, played as a nice Italian plumber who went around solving mysteries? That would be great, wouldn't it? But on a serious note, though, like if you look at what the sort of content that Japanese
made by the Japanese.
Yeah, if you look at the sort of content that Japanese society, a country that's not addicted to war, puts out, it's all, like Pokemon, and it's all Mario, and it's all like solving games and playing with your friends. But whereas when you look at the sort of Western output, it's all about violence, murder, stealing, etc. And I think, as you said, that does say something about our society.
Yeah, all of our games are from King Koopa's point of view. So let's move on to another one of your excellent articles. This one was about the fact checking that's going on at Facebook, but specifically about the proxy war in Ukraine. Now, if you were to call it a proxy war on Facebook, they might ban that post. But meanwhile, people such as the former head of the CIA, Leon Panetta, has said it's a proxy war. So we're talking about posting truth, and you often get censored, at very minimum suppressed on Facebook for putting these truths forward. So you did kind of a deep dive into who's deciding what's allowed on Facebook. What is fact on Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, this came out just at the start of the war where Facebook launched this new strategy. They said that they had announced that they were working with 9 separate fact-checking organizations to fact-check information for and about Ukraine and for for Eastern Europe more generally. And I immediately raised my suspicions.
Your journalist spidey sense went off.
Yeah, because quite frankly, we've got this entire cottage industry of fact-checking types that have anointed themselves like the arbiters of what's true and what's false. And when you look into their backgrounds, they are extremely shady. And this was definitely the case with the 9 selected to be fact-checkers about Ukraine. What I found was, at very least 5 of them are directly paid for and bankrolled by the US government, either through the infamous National Endowment for Democracy, which is a front group for the CIA, or by the US Embassy itself. And it's not like the other 4 were, completely above board. I found that at least 3 of the 4, so that makes 8 of the 9, had very close relationships indeed with Western governments, with NATO, or with the National Endowment for Democracy itself. And so there was only 1 out of the 9 which didn't have any pretty clear links to the US government. And that's a real problem because the United States is, of course, not some sort of neutral arbiter when it comes to the war in Ukraine. They're an active participant. They're sending weapons, they're sending aid to Ukraine, they're condemning Russia, etc. This isn't like, India who are trying to take a neutral stance, or Brazil, or whoever. This is the United States doing that. And so when these fact-checking organizations are dictating what is true and what is false online, that is a huge problem globally because, of course, Facebook isn't just an American company. It doesn't matter if you're in Botswana, Burundi, Brazil, or Brunei. Those fact-checkers are deciding what sort of content you see. And that should be absolutely hair-raising for anybody who cares about freedom of speech, because we've walked into this sort of situation whereby the US national security state is kind of dictating what we see and what we don't see at arm's length, and nobody even seems to realize that this is going on.
Yeah, and I know people nowadays, you say Facebook to someone who's like under 30 and they roll their eyes and go, who uses Facebook? Well, in fact, over 1 billion people a day, I think, still use Facebook. On top of that, you're talking overarchingly about Meta in general, which owns Instagram and WhatsApp as well. So the amount of information they can control is pretty breathtaking. I mean, there's never been a media outlet with that kind of reach.
Most definitely. I mean, apparently 3 billion people in the world, or 2.92 billion right now, have a Facebook account. And as you said, even if you are a Westerner who's a young person, you think Facebook is for granddads, it's not the case in the rest of the world. It's very different from country to country. And even if you don't use Facebook, you probably do use Instagram or WhatsApp. And so Mark Zuckerberg has, got his tenterhooks on his or his talons on something that you use constantly. And the sort of organizations that Facebook has trusted to decide what is true and what is false um, for Ukraine and Eastern Europe are incredible. I mean, probably the most
Yeah. Let's go through a few of them.
yeah, well, probably the most notorious one, or the most well-known, let's say, is Stop Fake, which is, well known in the West. It's funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, the UK government, and by the Atlantic Council, who we were just talking about. It was absolutely notorious until a few months ago. It had been the subject of a number of investigations by Western media for their links to Ukrainian neo-Nazi and paramilitary groups. Even the New York Times published a long investigation into them. Um, Perhaps the most famous person who worked for Stop Fake was Nina Yankovitz, who, if you don't remember, she was Biden's Ministry of Truth czar until earlier this year, when there was so much public pressure that they.
And for those who don't know,
closed
Ministry
that
of
thing
Truth
down.
was a name from 1984, the dystopian novel.
Oh, well, they called it. What did they call it? The Disinformation Council or whatever.
Something like that, yeah.
But ultimately, that was what was going on. Now, Yankovitz, who was supposed to be the head of this thing, can be seen still on YouTube from videos in 2017 defending and even lionizing groups like C14 or the IDAR Battalion or even the Azov Battalion, all of these far-right groups who she was presenting as heroes. And she was actually, or rather, Stop Fake was actually attacking mainstream outlets like Al Jazeera or CNN for saying that there was a rise in anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and groups like C14 had links to Nazi groups. Now, that should have been absolutely obvious, because 14 in C14's name is a reference to the 14 words, the white nationalist slogan, which I don't even want to say on here. We'll probably get kicked off. So yeah, ultimately, Yankovic was working for this group. And this is the group that has been, practicing Holocaust revisionism, defending Nazis. They are now tasked with deciding what is true and what is false for everyone in the US, everyone in Europe, everyone in the world, basically, when it comes to Ukraine and Eastern Europe. It is absolutely hair-raising and an incredible thing that's somehow been allowed to happen. But that just goes to show how much power social media has nowadays.
And then you talk about VoxCheck, which receives substantial monetary assistance from the U.S. government through NED, which again is a front, a brand laundering for the CIA and the U.S. Embassy, and Fact Check Georgia, which is bankrolled by a lot of dubious organizations.
Yeah, Fact Check Georgia is an interesting one. They're also bankrolled by the US Embassy and by the National Endowment for Democracy. And what's interesting about them is that even though they insist that they are a completely independent organization, the crest of both the National Endowment for Democracy and the US Embassy in Georgia appear on every single page of that website. And it's also accompanied by a disclaimer at the bottom of all their articles that says, "The views and opinions expressed on this website belong to Fact Check Georgia and are not the views and opinions of project support organizations." That's not the sort of sentence that you would put on your website if that was actually true. It's kind of like that old meme that says, my t-shirt that says I'm not involved in human trafficking has a lot of people asking questions that should have been answered by the t-shirt. It's absolutely blatant what is going on here, and nobody is calling it out except us, it seems. And I would say, just before you jump in, quite interesting, because there is a fair amount of evidence that Nina Yankovitz herself might have been ultimately the person most responsible for getting me and Mintpress kicked off of PayPal earlier this year.
Right. So just to reiterate that, PayPal, without really any explanation, just banned Mintpress and yourself. and you're in Mint Press is an outlet. You're an individual journalist, and this was within a month or two of Mint Press getting kicked off of GoFundMe as well. And yeah, there's multiple outlets, just like platforms just censoring and trying to purge outlets like this one that you and I both work for, Mint Press.
Yeah, that's right. And it wasn't just Mint Press, it was also a slew of alternative news websites. Like, I know Joe Lauria and Consortium News had this happen to them. There was a bunch of journalists who also worked for Russian-sponsored media that this happened to as well. And I think because this all happened in a oneer, it was pretty clear that it was a political statement, and it was a message sent to everybody working in the media. Do not do this, or this is the sort of these are the sorts of repercussions that could happen to you as well. It was a red line drawn, and journalists, even if it's not explicit, they understand where the red lines are. So this happened to us, and it could happen to anyone else at any time. But, frankly, we keep going on, and, if you're a Palestinian or a Syrian or a Cuban, you've already had this happen to you with PayPal. So it's not like we can't keep functioning, but we certainly do need the support of our viewers and listeners as well.
Yeah, so now is a good time to just pause for a second and say, hey, folks, if you want to see journalism like this, like Alan's, like mine, continue, then please become a member on Patreon. There's a Patreon for Behind the Headlines. There's a Patreon for Mint Press. We hope you will join us. Behind the Headlines is the video platform of Mint Press. And yeah, we're completely independently funded. So we're not connected to anything. And before I was with Mint Press, I had a show on RT that was, the sanctions caused them to shut down the entire network, my TV show along with it. But simultaneously, the YouTube channel with 250,000 subscribers was banned globally, over 1,000 videos banned globally. Also, at the same time, my personal podcast on Spotify was deleted for no reason. So, you see these things and they just kind of chase you and delete you as much as they can. And we're hoping, and Mint Press hopes, to continue to fight against this as we do every day. So,
yeah, one more thing I'll say about that is it was clearly political because I actually hadn't used my PayPal account to receive money since July 2021. So it was like 10 months previous that I hadn't received.
It wasn't like you just got an influx of money from a Palestinian wealthy donor. It was like you haven't used it in a year.
Yeah. So I actually thought when I got the email that they were shutting it down, it was because of inactivity. And I was like, yeah, whatever. So I kind of missed the boat in terms of the censorship thing. It kind of already went away because, yeah, as I said, I hadn't received any money from it for probably 10 months. And I'd only used it to buy things for like $5 on eBay a couple of times in that time, and none since December 2021. So it was like pushing 6 months between me using this thing to buy like a USB cable and a pair of headphones or something, and getting this email saying that we're closing your account because of all this suspicious activity that you've been doing. It's just, what are you talking about? It's absolutely obvious what's going on. We didn't get any response from PayPal when we tried to talk to them. Everybody knows what's up.
Well, it must have been a pretty fucking creepy USB cable you bought. So, so continuing on the Facebook revelations, but this is actually a different article you put out about all of the ex-CIA agents deciding Facebook's content policy. You've also done one. It wasn't just about PayPal. It was, about Facebook. It was about other social media, or tech companies like Google. With many of them were in one of the highest departments in the IDF, the Israeli military, and they went straight to Google. Over 100 people are at Google right now, and they're usually in higher up positions, straight from an apartheid government's incredibly disgusting, awful, belligerent military. And so I wonder if you can talk just for a minute about that and also get into the ex-CIA agents at Facebook.
Yeah, so we're dunking on Facebook a little, but I do have articles about TikTok, about the Unit 8200 at Google, and about Twitter as well. So I'm kind of an equal opportunity
Right.
muckraker when it comes to that. But Facebook specifically, it's a pretty important organization. As we said, nearly 3 billion people use Facebook itself every month. Um, and I really got interested in this at the time when Donald Trump was kicked off of Facebook and all the platforms simultaneously. I couldn't find anywhere on the website or any sort of information about who were actually the people who were responsible for making this decision. And I ultimately only found it when I went to LinkedIn, the social media site for employment and for executives, where I was able to find who is actually on these panels, these content moderation panels and these trust and safety panels. Who are the people that Facebook are employing to do this? And if you go to fb.com, which is Facebook, and you look at content moderation and their part, they will show you a lovely video with a guy called Aaron. He's wearing a purple sweater. He looks very nice. He's very friendly. He comes
This guy
across as a
here.
really nice guy. Yeah, this guy right there. He comes across as a really nice guy. He talks a lot about how freedom of speech is very important to him and how he and his team are really kept up late at nights thinking about, weighing up what should we allow and what shouldn't we allow. And we always want to, err on the side of allowing speech, etc. And it's very important to be completely transparent. All of that's quite ironic because it's not entirely transparent, that video, because Aaron is in fact a CIA agent, or at least he was until 2019 when he left his job as one of the highest ranking members of the CIA to be parachuted into the very top of Facebook's content moderation strategy. His name is Aaron Berman, and until 2019, he was actually the writer of the president's daily brief, which means things that he wrote about intelligence would be read by President Obama and then probably read out aloud to President Trump, because we know he doesn't read. So he was clearly a very important person at the CIA. And he goes from 1 week working at the CIA to the next week deciding content strategy for the biggest social media company in the world that affects, as we said, nearly 3 billion people. And Aaron Berman's not a singular case. I was able to find dozens upon dozens of former CIA agents, usually relatively high up in the agency, that had been given these jobs in Facebook. And almost to a man, they were not in politically unsensitive fields, politically neutral fields like sales or customer service or marketing or anything like that.
Right.
It was in trust and safety, it was in content moderation, and it was in security. Ultimately, these are the people who decide what Facebook looks like and what billions of users around the world see and what they don't see. And that is an incredible power to have, to be able to control those algorithms. And so I, for one, am quite skeptical of the idea that all these CIA agents woke up and just decided to leave the company and got these great jobs at Facebook on the back of their own brilliance. None of these people are whistleblowers. They haven't come out and talked. They're not like an Edward Snowden. They've just come from the agency and been planted into Silicon Valley. And that's really the thrust of my research in the past couple of years, is really looking at the connections between the two. And I'm really at the point where I find it very difficult to see where the national security state ends and where big social media starts.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there at the end is perhaps the most important point. This is not just, oh man, this is concerning that the CIA is deleting posts at Facebook. When it's this many and this high positions are connected to IDF, CIA, military, etc., you really start to see that Facebook is kind of an unspoken, another limb to the military-industrial complex system. It may not be fully owned by the Pentagon or Raytheon, but with this many people within it, and they were brought there for a reason, with this many people within it that are CIA and military and IDF, there's a reason for that. It's not just we didn't like that someone said Ukraine's a proxy war. It's much larger in terms of, you know, the wars being fought now. Many of them are data wars, and who owns the data owns the world, I think, and in many ways. And so the Pentagon knows that, and the CIA knows that, and they're doing something about it.
Yeah, we like to think of big tech companies as kind of like stateless entities just flowing around in the ether, but they're not. They are nuts. They're sort of bricks and mortar companies that are, for the most part, located in the United States, usually in California, and they are subject to American laws. So, for instance, we were talking about Soleimani earlier and how the US assassinated him. Because Soleimani was the head of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which was designated by the Trump administration as a terrorist organization. That meant that all content that was praising Soleimani or expressing outrage at the Trump's killing of a national hero had to, by law, be censored by Facebook. And so that meant that in Iran, there were millions of Iranians talking to other Iranians in Farsi who had their posts and content and comments deleted, even though they were sharing an opinion that probably between 90 and 99% of their countrymen agreed with. And that was because of US law. Facebook has also used its big social media clout to try and swing elections. For instance, last November, there was a very important election in Nicaragua, which pitted the Sandinista government, the leftist government, which the US has been trying to kick out of the country for 40 years, up against a right-wing party led by the Chamorro dynasty. We talked about Oliver North earlier. The Iran-Contra affair was all about selling weapons to Iran and then using that money to fund death squads in Nicaragua, which would go around destroying the population, killing farmers, etc., and just generally terrorizing the country into accepting US domination. Well, in November, I believe Facebook, around a week before the election, really put its foot on the scales. And what it did was it deleted dozens, I believe almost 100 accounts of big media outlets, politicians, trade unions, and other influencers in Nicaragua, all of whom were pro-Sandinista. And that had the effect of basically silencing left-wing voices from Nicaraguan social media. It's quite a small country, so when you're deleting 93 media outlets or big figures in a day, that really has a huge outcome. Facebook claimed that this was because of they were inauthentic accounts or that they were bots. Very interestingly, a lot of these people went onto Twitter. They recorded videos of themselves saying, "This is who I am. This was my account. You can see the face matches, etc., etc. I am not a bot." And very interestingly, what happened to most of those people was Twitter actually deleted their accounts immediately as well, in what the Nicaragua-based journalist Ben Norton called a virtual double tap strike. And so ultimately, Facebook tried to swing an election. So I would say, even if you don't like the Sandinistas or even if you like Facebook, you might find that Facebook is doing this to a political party you like in the future, wherever you are in the world. And so that is an incredible amount of power to have. And there's barely anyone scrutinizing this at all.
Yeah, and basically what happened in 2016 is that they failed, quote unquote, Facebook failed to suppress the socialist in the race, Bernie Sanders. And at the time, I was, posting a lot of the stuff Bernie Sanders was saying, and posting a lot about how rigged the primaries were and things like that. And so in 2016, I was my Facebook page, which was my biggest platform. I have 330,000 followers. And after that election was where Facebook really changed everything. They were told by our government, you are allowing false information, Russian information, whatever you want to call it. And so you have to crack down. And so immediately after that 2016 election, my page became essentially shadow banned with 330,000 followers. I'm lucky if 1% or less see any post I put up. And I've never been able to grow. I used to gain 5,000 followers a week, and now I haven't gained since. And so this is how, this stuff works, is basically after that moment, Facebook has been a completely different platform. Stuff cannot go viral, really, not to the extent it used to, unless it is approved by all the people we've been detailing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was that shock of the 2016 election which really spurred the US to really decide almost overnight. It seems from that book, Shattered, that it was literally on the night of the election that the Clinton campaign decided that fake news, especially foreign fake news, was the reason she lost. Not because she stabbed Bernie in the back or didn't campaign in the swing states or had the most vacuous, least policy orientated campaign in modern history. It was none of that. It was because of Macedonian teenagers sharing memes on the internet. Now, of course, I want to be clear that Facebook and the rest of the internet is flooded with false information. But
Yeah.
as somebody who studies this, I do want to say that fake news goes much deeper and is much more profound than a bunch of bloggers sharing some stupid stuff about UFOs or whatever. I would say the most pernicious and harmful fake news of the 21st century were the lies that got us into the war in Iraq or the bombing of Libya. These sorts of conflicts killed millions of people or displaced millions of more. And where did that fake news come from? It came from the government, and it was pushed by outlets like CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, and BBC, all of the groups that are now trusted as the most legitimate, perfect, unimpeachable sources. And it's not like we even have an internet that isn't filled with fake news right now. In the past few weeks, we've seen some terrible fake news going viral about how, for instance, the Iranian government has killed or sentenced to death 15,000 protesters. Not true. Or how Russia fired a missile on Poland. Not true. It was actually, it seems, a Ukrainian missile.
Yeah, it's a Ukrainian missile. And the 15,000 thing, in fact, it was one person who was sentenced to death. And even the mainstream media, with both of those stories you just mentioned, ultimately had to admit that they had it wrong. But by then, what's the thing? A lie can get around the world before the truth can get its shoes tied.
Exactly, yeah.
That's basically what it was. The mainstream media will sometimes admit they got something wrong, but it's such a tiny report compared to 24/7 of whatever the bullshit was.
Yeah, and so ultimately the only effect of this massive change in all the algorithms that we saw in late 2016, early 2017 with Google, Facebook, Twitter, et al., has been to retighten the state's grip over the means of communication and throttle loads of high-quality alternative media websites. I know, for instance, Mint Press News lost something like 90% of its Google traffic almost overnight when Google launched Project Owl. Other websites like Democracy Now!, The Intercept, Consortium News, all of those places have also suffered similar irreparable losses. And in fact, Mark Zuckerberg himself admitted to the Wall Street Journal in October last year that he personally has decided to throttle outlets such as Mother Jones specifically because of their political content. Now, if you think about how liberal and milquetoast and Beltway Mother Jones is, and they are being targeted for just being swatted, what do you think is going on to places like Mid-Press or accounts like yours? Everybody who is in this milieu knows what's going on. And it's one of the most incredible things that's happened, because there was this sort of semi-golden era in the early 2010s when alternative media personalities could grow. And what we found was in places like YouTube and Facebook and anywhere on the internet, we were wiping the floor with places like CNN or Fox or the New York Times, because people went to the internet specifically to get away from what they saw on the television, which was this nonsense drivel, which was just Beltway stuff, completely vapid, etc. And they found the real news online. But unfortunately, it's becoming harder and harder for people to do that, even if they consciously subscribe to figures, because they're just simply not shown what they want to be shown. And so ultimately, the brave new online world is starting to look an awful lot like the old media landscape, which even as we speak is continuing to die.
I actually, that works nicely to bring us to my next question. These last 10 minutes, I thought I'd talk with you a little more broadly about your views on our mainstream media right now, and how you found yourself doing this work. Did you, when you were a teenager or something, did you envision being a journalist for one of the mainstream outlets, or did you always know that they were bullshit and you weren't going to be there?
Oh man, I didn't know what the heck I was going to do when I was a teenager. I thought I'd end up working in a gym or something. I don't know. I went through quite a good education at like quite elite schools, but I come from quite a sort of working class background, and I always felt like I just didn't fit in, and I didn't understand it when people were speaking politics. One of my first political groups that I went to was the Politics Society, a very kind of well thought of university, and the topic was assessing Tony Blair's legacy. And I naively thought everybody would be going in there talking about hanging him for war crimes. But in fact, some Labour spin doctor came in and said he did this marvelous job, moving to the center and all of this. And all the people around me, these 20-year-olds wearing tweed jackets with leather patches, were like, oh, yes, indubitably, yes, yes. So I didn't know what the hell was going on. And it was only after I finished a freaking master's degree that I started reading. I started almost by chance happening on stuff like Noam Chomsky's work and people like Tariq Ali or Hajin Chang, or loads of like good thinkers and writers who really turned me on to looking at society in a different way. And it was specifically the book Manufacturing Consent, which is about the media, which got me thinking about that. And I started studying and writing about the media. And from there, that's kind of how I actually got in, because I was criticizing it. And then sort of all indie media websites started contacting me, asking if I could write for them. And it just snowballed from there. So I completely backed my way into this profession, which so many people are really, really wanting to get into. But I kind of fell into it in a very odd way, which probably makes a lot of people quite annoyed and jealous.
Well, it's because you do amazing work. You also, other than your in-depth articles, you just post. I just love your Twitter and your Instagram, because it's often just a headline from Washington Post or any of these outlets, mainstream media outlets, and just tearing them apart correctly or rephrasing it in a way the way it should read, and so. Well, first of all, also tell people how to follow you on those platforms. But I want to hear, kind of your thoughts in general on the mainstream media now, and whether you think it's worse or better than it was 5 and 10 years ago.
Yeah, you can follow me at Twitter. That's where I'm most active, at Alan R. MacLeod, or on Instagram, alan.r.macleod. Of course, we never know if Twitter is going to be there next week or not. So who knows where that's going.
Although I now have, I mean, Elon Musk is a sad sociopathic man. So I'm not defending him, but I've started to have a bit of hope that maybe he'll take off the governors that have been put on like anything that doesn't fit in the CNN talking points realm. And so all of a sudden, people like you and me will see our tweets doing much better.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah, but I guess our media landscape, something that's not talked about a lot is just how Facebook and Google destroyed the entire basis for how the media functioned up until the early 2000s. Their incredibly accurate internet-based marketing systems are basically based on them spying on us and having all of our details so that they can hyper-target ads to us. What that has meant is that advertising companies have decided to completely jettison their budgets for advertising on TV, radio, newspapers, etc., and have moved it online, which has meant a huge fall, just a collapse in the sort of revenue that big legacy media can bring in. And what that's meant is that they've been firing people left, right, and center for years and years. And we've got to the point where these outlets are really run on skeleton crews that are just given press releases and just put them up. There's no sort of like investigative reporting left. However, the rise of the internet has led to the opportunity to start new outlets, new newsletters, websites, YouTube platforms, whatever. So there are definitely a lot more ways in which we can try and get our message out. However, as we've seen in the past few years, that has been rolled back massively. And so ultimately, we are living through the death of one system and hopefully the birth of another. But, you know, in the last few years, the US government has really tried to reel that second alternative model in. So what it's going to look like in 10 years, I'm really not sure.
Yeah, me either. What are you working on next?
Don't have too much on the go. I'm going to be possibly doing a sequel to this Call of Duty thing, looking at some of the main guys and their connections to, again, the Israeli government and the Israeli military. That could be coming in the line. Apart from that, just going to be continuing to write stuff at Mint Press News.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Alan. I can't thank you enough, and let's do this again soon. I love working with you at Mint Press, so keep it up.
Yeah, man. Same back, right back at you.
All right, everybody. It was Alan MacLeod. Listen, if you thought you got anything out of this interview, I hope you will become a member at patreon.com/behindtheheadlines. We've just started getting that Patreon running to support the video content that Mint Press makes. Behind the Headlines is their video platform. And, you know, support Mint Press completely, as it says on the screen, 100% funded by viewers. There's no massive corporate entities. There's no governments. There's nothing behind it except you guys. So I hope you will do that. And I do 2 of these interviews a week. Tomorrow will be Scott Ritter. Everyone seems to be asking for me to speak with him again. And so I'm excited to do that. This will be my first extended interview with him, a full hour with Scott Ritter. If anybody knows what's happening in Ukraine, in our proxy war over there, it's fucking him. And he's been right about essentially everything. And yeah, that's why many of his posts have been going viral, is because he continues to be right with all of his predictions and everything else. So please join me tomorrow, I believe at the same time, noon Eastern, right here on either youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. Yeah, that's the best place, youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. But we're on other platforms as well, but I think that's the best one to go to. And yeah, thanks a lot. Most Censored News, a new episode comes out every week. And that also will be at youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. We just got over 10,000 subscribers, and it's a new channel. So I know that's not millions, but to get that already is great. So please hit subscribe. Even if you're not a big YouTube user, I hope you will go over there and click subscribe, because that helps us, helps our algorithm, all that stuff. All right. I will see you tomorrow, and keep fighting.